Any ninjutsu curriculum worth your time must instill in your mind the pertinence of survival skills to the path of the ninja. As I have stated elsewhere on this channel, shinobi were not the creatures of comfort that may be associated with the dojos of contemporary civilization. Their lives were difficult by comparison to we who enjoy the convenience of modern infrastructure with its electricity, abundant water on tap, and the cellophane packaging ubiquitous among food, drink, and myriad products of a consumption era unlike the world has ever seen. What we would call survivalism was just the way of life for a shinobi, who, depending on the task assigned, would have to source his food, water, shelter, and other basic necessities from a natural environment, one way or another, every day of his mission in the field. Of course, exceptions are to be found with those who dwelled and operated in towns and villages, but for the most part the presence of survivalism as a core component of ninjutsu is owed to the truth that shinobi were employed as an element of the armed forces of feudal Japan. An army is no good if its troops don't know the basics of how to sustain themselves in the absence of supply carts, or when circumstances don't permit subsistence by plundering keeps of the enemy. This is especially true for the shinobi of the Sengoku Jidai, who often operated as shock troops and forward reconnaissance units, traveling far beyond the bounds of the Allied forces' traditional Monomi scouts. For these missions in Japan's wilderness, a shinobi could and did carry a variety of items that would keep one alive for the short term. But if dispatches into the field extended into weeks and months, the ninja had to have the resilience of creatures of the earth, living, moving, and fighting as one with the elements and kami, or spirits of his surroundings. And herein lies the veracity of the point that ninjutsu students need to know how to survive. The Gunyo Hiki of the Bansen Shukai communicates as much with its advice on how to filter water from a marsh with paper or drink seawater that has been treated with a special clay. The extant texts of the shinobi are replete with recipes for hunger pills, torches, methods of creating and transporting fire, points on night and daytime navigation, medicinal mixtures procured from plants, a host of tools and structures created from natural materials, and an untold number of implicit ideas concerning what is necessary to operate remotely as a shinobi. Let's explore some of the basics together. Water. Sources of water for a shinobi included mountain streams, lakes, ponds, rivers, the rain and snow, and if necessary, marshes, moats, and ocean water. This water was collected with bamboo containers, helmets, tenugui, and other containers such as gourd-shaped hisago, and perhaps even bladder skins of animals. Shinobi were aware that certain sources of water can make them sick, and therefore opted to drink from fast-moving rivers or relatively cleaner mountain streams rather than risk health with stagnant pond water. A shinobi could boil water, as this was a known method in their time of making water potable, but stealth mission requirements might ultimately determine whether they did this. Food. A few of the primary staples of a shinobi diet included fish, buckwheat flour, and rice. Their diet was further supplemented with any number of fruits and vegetables that were native to Japan. A well-known recipe for a ninja's rations, known as hunger pills, consists of flour, yams, rice powder, ginseng, coax seed, and licorice. After being soaked in sake for 3 years, these ingredients were packed together into a tight ball about the size of a peach seed, and would be consumed at a rate of 3 a day to sustain a shinobi in need of food. What is not expressly stated in the texts regarding food is what we can expect from pre-modern living conditions. If a shinobi found it necessary to acquire food on a mission, he would have been equipped with the tracking, hunting, and wilderness knowledge to take down game and identify edible plant species. This is inferred from the conditions of their time and a statement within the Gunyo Hiki advising on the use of hunger pill rations when, quote, "you have no alternative way to feed yourself." This statement conveys that a shinobi would not use his hunger pill rations as the first and principal means of sustaining himself, instead leaving the rations on his person for emergency food when his hunting, fishing, and gathering knowledge was of no use, like in situations where he has to lay low and avoid detection for an extended period, or when a battle-torn area has already been picked clean of food sources. The hunger pill or kikatsugun recipe noted in the Bansen Shukai will make a batch of food around 9 pounds or so in weight when the sake has dried out, and will sustain a shinobi up to 24 days, assuming each hunger pill weighs around 2 ounces and the entire batch is carried. The ingredients of these pills would provide modest levels of all 3 macronutrients, such as your protein, carbohydrates, and fats, as well as micronutrients for cellular maintenance, electrolyte replacement, and maintaining energy levels. The hunger pill ingredient of the Japanese yam, for example, is high in vitamins C, B, E, and A, thus helping to prevent scurvy, assist with wound healing, and immune system function. The Japanese yam is also high in tryptophan and even calcium, which is important for muscle contraction. Though bodily wasting would still likely occur when subsisting exclusively on these hunger pills, a shinobi could still survive and operate on this meager Kikatsugan ration. Shelter. Ninja are known to have slept on the ground, in natural and debris shelters, and even in caves. Though there is little in the way of shelter left behind in their documents, we know shinobi would operate for many days in the wilderness areas, which would require a knowledge of shelter building and the means of protecting the body from the elements. The seasons would determine how and where they would rest, and their clothing and equipment likely factored into how they created a living space when needed. The shikoro, or hand saw, that we find in the ninja tools section of the Bansen Shukai could double as a shelter building and trap construction implement, in addition to providing a way to cut through the enemy's fences. Security. Operating in the wilderness of enemy territory, if the natural elements weren't trying to kill a shinobi, human enemies would be. Though preservation of the self through the use of force was indeed a constituent mode of operation for a shinobi, it was not primary to satisfying their security needs. Instead of arming themselves with loads of weapons to be deployed in a direct confrontation with the enemy, a shinobi, as we all know, preferred to employ stealth and deception to overtake their opponents. Direct confrontations with the enemy were actually to be avoided, especially if the shinobi and his allies were outnumbered, and so the principle of stealth within Magakure no Sute, or tradition of hiding from sight, is present in many of their arts. Stealth was the ninja's primary means of maintaining security. Eliminating a relatively stronger opposition is not achievable without evening the playing field with tactics and measures stemming from an overarching strategy of using the unorthodox to one's advantage. Shinobi were partial to tactics that exhibited a wise economy of force, being able to conserve one's energy while simultaneously maintaining security and striking at the enemy from a distance. For this purpose, wana, or traps, were often constructed by shinobi to slow down, exhaust, injure, intimidate, and deter enemy patrols, and even enemy ninja. Evidence substantiating this claim derives from texts like the Bansen Shukai, Shinobi Hiden, and the scrolls of Yorihide of Iga, which speak of traps common to ninjutsu, including the Harahata Barai, caltrops, the bow in your absence, the Tsuryoshi, or deadfall, and even landmines. A shinobi was advised to place Tsuryoshi on all routes into a base camp area, including trails that would be used by enemy ninja. Trip lines made from plant fibers and bamboo would trigger the release of dead weight, like stones and logs, from a concealed position high up in the trees. Or, if operating in a village, mortar stones and heavy beams would be suspended above entrances to dwellings. Trip lines triggering these traps were so much a part of ninjutsu that they were considered an art unto themselves, to be mastered by shinobi to maximize their efficacy in psychologically manipulating enemies. The art of trip lines is known as ashikarami no jutsu. With a simple length of rope, a ninja enhances the security of his camp in the following ways. For one, lines were stretched around a perimeter with bamboo tubes attached to make noise when they were triggered. These were simple but effective warning systems in a time when people were relatively more attuned to their senses. The same lines could be attached to trigger mechanisms, releasing weights, projectiles, and spiked maces. Sometimes shinobi would place trip lines that were inert or not attached to any trap engine. This was done to get into the minds of enemy patrols. After encountering two or more of these inert trip lines, an enemy could become emboldened and throw caution to the wind as they proceeded further and encountered more of these lines, obviously or less obviously placed. If they lost all caution, then a critical mistake would be made when they cut or cross a line they believed as fake, falling into the trap of being psychologically disarmed, up to the point when a massive mortar stone comes sailing down onto their heads. The inverse of this method, laying real traps followed by a series of fake ones, would create the opposite effect of forcing the enemy to use caution and thereby slow down their advance into an area, giving shinobi time to determine their next move. Sometimes a shinobi would come out of hiding to bait the enemy to follow them into kill zones, as is evidenced by their Gunpo Jiyoshu scrolls, which admonish warriors to never chase enemy shinobi, as they were known to lay kiarimachi, or ambushes, assisted by komori, or ambush troops. We also know from these scrolls that shinobi knew how to construct arrow launchers that would be carried while traveling and deployed to guard a room while a shinobi was sleeping or absent for whatever reason. This trap was triggered by disturbing a line attached to a piece of bamboo over a sliding door. A shinobi would let his traps work for him against the enemy while he pursued other activities necessary to his survival. His weapons were necessary only for unavoidable conflict, or if an attack's success probability was in his favor. If a shinobi's first move when encountering opposition is to use force in direct confrontation with an adversary he has not studied, something is wrong with his ninjutsu. The ninja's hand-to-hand skills, or taijutsu, have their place, but they are not that relevant to survival situations. The hand-to-hand skills of shinobi, however, do increase one's general security standing, and for this reason I include them. But they are more for dealing with threats in a covert espionage setting when the object wasn't to kill the opponent. Let's go back to the concept of stealth as the primary means of maintaining security. Because a shinobi's presence in an area must not be betrayed by leaving traps all over the place, it might be best to take up other measures in the course of his operations. It is difficult to attack an enemy that you cannot see, track, or otherwise detect, and so shinobi knew the value of natural camouflage, disturbing the natural environment as little as possible, concealing their movements in wind, rain, and darkness, and exercising a stern fire discipline. According to Jack Kelly's 2005 book titled Gunpowder, Alchemy, Bombards, and Pyrotechnics, Huoyao, or fire drug, is what the ancient Chinese alchemists called gunpowder, a substance used in health elixirs to ill effects until its true potential as a weapon was realized. After much trial and error, these alchemists successfully innovated the tripart mixture of potassium nitrate, sulfur, and carbon into a usable tool of puissant potential for war. In the 13th century, this fire drug would arrive in Japan by way of 2 invasions by the Mongol army, and there its manufacture and use would become a special skill set of the shinobi no mono. The fire skills, or kajutsu, of shinobi would never have been possible without the knowledge of gunpowder. A survey of the fire tools in the texts they left behind communicates this with scores of recipes for rockets, clay sphere grenades, landmines, torches, fuses, and flame-producing blinding powders. With these tools, a shinobi was able to burn down castles, incinerate entire villages, send light far away on an arrow, produce an expedient emergency fire, and create fulminations that startled and threw the organization of an enemy into chaos. The ignition source for a ninja's torches and hinawa fuses, or literally fire rope, was a bamboo container of char cloth which produced glowing embers with a strike of flint and steel. These embers could be carried over long distances and were fed by the shinobi's breath to ignite torinoko, or fire eggs made of bundled straw, that were then touched to the gunpowder mixtures of torches, permitting rapid lighting of multiple tools at once, a method of action suitable for night raids. In a lead up to a raid, shinobi would combine stealth with fire to observe an enemy in their sleep, sometimes using blowgun darts with gunpowder payloads to light up a room or a gondo lantern. The Bonsen Shukai advises a shinobi to light a torch on one side of a dwelling and to peer in from another, keeping oneself hidden in the shadows should the enemy awake and fix attention on the lit torch. Armed with the knowledge of the layout of the enemy complex and how many targets they were dealing with, a large team of shinobi would be dispatched to the enemy complex on a moonless night, preferably with strong wind conditions. At a distance of about 100 or 200 meters, the koshi, also known as the fire performer, would begin lighting his torinoko eggs and take up a position close to the target for hoka, what is known as an arson attack. He would carry a bundle of torches, a dozen or so being common for a 2-man team, and would start lighting them once the signal was given. On his right stood his hizo, or fire assistant, who would help him throw the torches, expediting the attack process. As the flames of these torches began to spread around the perimeter and over the target, another section of the shinobi team would take up position by the doorways of the structures and draw rope across the entranceways. Shinobi would funnel the occupants of a burning complex to dedicated kill zones in this way, locking other entrances from the outside with a Z-shaped iron tool. Those who would awake during the raid to a building in flames would rush to escape through the only entrances that were not blocked. After tripping over the ashikarami traps on the way out, the enemy was swiftly eliminated by blade the moment they hit the ground. Those who could not find an escape route or did not wake up were incinerated. This was the brutal but effective means by which shinobi would take their opponents by surprise in their sleep, always leaving little chance for survival to the enemy. This is one reason why the duty of a village watchman and togiki listening scouts was vital. For if they could not detect the start of a raid in its incipient stages, it would send many to their deaths. Shinobi knew this, which is why within the Bonsen Shukai there are repeated precepts of knowing the inclination to laziness within human beings, and how watchmen tend to become inattentive over a time of inactivity. This laziness and inattentiveness gets people killed, and may lead to the destruction of a castle. These arson attacks were among the most important jobs of a shinobi. If a castle was vaunted by the enemy as unimpregnable, a shinobi would rise to the the challenge and infiltrate with ease by yonin disguise arts and inin athletic skills. Once in the castle, the shinobi would map it out and communicate with his allies outside by means of yobumi, or messages attached to arrows, detailing the going-ons inside the castle and the proper time for a siege. Once the signal was received, perhaps by way of a Naroshi smoke signal, the shinobi would set fire to gunpowder stores, food stores, and wood supply within the castle. The ensuing flames would confuse and occupy the enemy as the allies of the shinobi moved into position around the castle to engage from the outside. In these situations, it was a ninja's skill of hoka that produced the conditions for victory, and so relevant to notions of survival, it is historically evident that shinobi were quite familiar with the means of starting, carrying, feeding, smothering, and utilizing fire as a tool. Their uchitake and flint and steel were everyday carry items essential for food preparation, warmth, destruction of structures and messages, and signaling. As the knowledge of starting fires is considered basic to survival, we can say shinobi were well beyond the basics with their wide knowledge of incendiary warfare and the fact that they lived during a time when primitive and rudimentary fire-starting skills were common to most people. As evidenced by volumes 21 and 22 of the Bansen Shukai, a ninja's recipes for incendiaries conveys requirements that prove ninjutsu involves knowing how to source fire resources from the natural environment. Pine resin, for example, is known to modern survivalists as an aid in fire building, but they may not know that ninja collected and used this substance to a great degree in modifying the burn rate of their black powders, and it was also applied to torches as a flammable hydrophobic to repel water. Other common ingredients in their fire tools include camphor, moxa, wolf, hawk, and mouse droppings, green tea, and chili pepper. For example, a recipe for a smoke signal called the Naroshi signal powder calls for a mixture of wolf droppings, moxa, saltpeter, and ash, while an attack torch calls for gunpowder, camphor, moxa, pine resin, mouse droppings, and powdered green tea. While I'm on the subject of ingredients for tools, let me posit a theory on a tool called uniqueness that we find in the Bansen Shukai. The ingredients for this tool are in code: 112 grams of moon, 215 grams of sun, 29 grams of star. A researcher named Yunoki Shunichiro believes, on the basis of cross-referencing the gunpowder ingredient amounts among the Bansen Shukai's recipes, that sun is saltpeter, sulfur is moon, and ash is star. I think this is incorrect because the Chinese alchemists associate sun with sulfur as it is yang, and moon with saltpeter as it is yin. This would help explain why this tool is labeled as unique, because it calls for double the amount of sulfur relative to saltpeter, making for a unique burn. But this is just a theory. In studying the fire arts of ninjutsu, a student may be impressed with the following practical considerations relevant to survival. First, one should carry a lighter or other fire-starting implement at all times, as one may never know when a fire will be needed. This is especially important in the cold seasons. Second, one should appreciate and respect the destructive power of fire. Fire is not something to be played with, and a ninja fully understood this, especially when mixing gunpowder. Incendiary warfare is given extensive attention in ninjutsu, as strong fires can lay waste to whatever they touch, particularly under conditions of high wind. Shinobi were known to destroy entire villages by setting fires in one burst, in synergy with wind, breathing life into the inferno. Lastly, know that there are many naturally occurring substances, pine resin for example, that can aid you in building emergency fire. No matter the gear you possess or the skills you've trained to excel in, without sleep you won't last in the long term. This critical activity that we all take for granted has a special place in the art of ninjutsu, as it is considered a weakness to be exploited and a strength to maintain, according to the scrolls of the shinobi. We all know that the human animal requires sleep for a third of its existence. Without it, the body and mind suffer greatly. Sleep is essential for clearing waste products from the brain with the actions of glymphatic processes that are most active when resting. Consequently, if we don't get enough sleep, the nervous system is deleteriously affected, resulting in a lack of focus, deterioration of memory, hormonal imbalances, susceptibility to infection, slower processing and reaction times, and at the extreme end of sleep deprivation, we get effects like hallucinations, paranoia, stroke, and death. Getting less than 6 hours of sleep a night increases the risk of stroke by over 300%. And in the case of an unfortunate genetic disorder known as fatal familial insomnia, wherein the inheritor loses sleep to the point that he or she cannot sleep at all, death ultimately results merely from the lack of sleep. So just as food, water, shelter, and fire are crucial to the survival of a shinobi, getting sleep must be part of a plan for subsistence. Because everyone has to sleep at some point, it is reasonable that we find throughout history military tactics that were engineered to take advantage of the enemy's slumber. Shinobi are widely known for their nighttime operations, the details of which are conveyed in historical documents such as the Bansen Chukai. In volume 13 of this text, we encounter observations about sleep that shinobi deemed important for nighttime infiltrations, such as how to profile people to determine their sleep patterns and how to tell if someone is feigning sleep, as well as methods for harassing the enemy so that they cannot rest easy. We are informed by the shinobi ways that the elderly tend to sleep less while the overweight might sleep more. Alert, vigilant military types will be quick to rouse from light sleep, and if someone is heavily intoxicated, once they pass out, it will be easy to infiltrate their residence. We are also told within this text that those of a firm body and who are trained on the consequences of not keeping a strict watch will not sleep deeply. This all depends on environmental and circumstantial factors, however, such as seasons and whether it is a time of peace or war. A few of the observations respecting sleep in relation to the seasons recorded by the shinobi are that in the winter months, people tend to have a difficulty falling and staying asleep, whereas in the spring and summer months, a cool, light drizzle of rain actually assists witnesses of the potential infiltration to fall into a deep sleep. However, in addition to these general rules of thumb, further assessment measures were required prior to infiltrating. For example, a shinobi might carry a kikitsuzu, or listening cylinder. They would press this tool up against walls and doors to listen for signs of an enemy in slumber, or the stirring within, indicating that someone is awake. The snoring of the enemy assisted the shinobi in identifying where they were located within the dwelling, leading up to a night raid, or concealing oneself inside the structure for intelligence collection purposes, and even outright assassinations in the dead of night. If a shinobi could not detect the enemy by listening for snoring or movement, a technique known as kyonin, or startling the enemy, was used to rouse and draw out the presence and location of their targets. Kyonin could take the shape of a fellow shinobi making a lot of sound in front of the dwelling and faking an illness, or staging a confusing altercation that beckons the guards out of the dwelling to respond. Or a shinobi might simply make animal sounds, such as a cat or dog, to educe a response from the inhabitants of the residence, the former being a way to create a gap in the enemy's defense to get a shinobi into the dwelling and listen as things settled down, while the latter technique could be used to know where the enemy is sleeping while keeping the human form concealed, and even harass the enemy throughout the night for many nights to keep them from getting the rest they need to be an effective fighting force. In addition to these tactics of exhausting the enemy by chronic harassment throughout the nights, shinobi would augment their hidden advantages by coupling the principle of the dream pillow, or yume makura no daiji, with the active phase of their nighttime operations. This principle, recorded in the Gokui Ten no Maki scroll, admonishes the shinobi to not rely on methods of staying awake, but instead, one should ensure the shinobi team is getting enough sleep by taking turns in rotating shifts. If this team was hidden in a secure location, a few shinobi could be dispatched to harass the enemy, while another part of the team slept easy. Shinobi called this method of sleeping in shifts nete nezare no sute, or the tradition of sleeping while not sleeping. Although ninja did have a training discipline that would adapt them to the effects of having little sleep, such as avoiding comfort, refusing to lay down, and generally subjecting oneself to miserable conditions, Fujibayashi Yasutake informs the ninjutsu student in volume 11 of the Bansen Chukai that no matter how encouraged you feel, you cannot perform anything well without sleep, going on to advise the shinobi on the importance of getting a nap prior to a nighttime infiltration. Yes, a nap. Interesting enough, in a presentation put on by Harvard Medical School titled Why Sleep Matters, researchers asserted their evidence for the astounding effects of a 90-minute nap, stating that one such nap produces as much memory and information processing restoration benefit as a night of 8 hours of sleep. So take it from the ninja. Naps are powerful. The takeaway from all this is that sleep was just as vital to shinobi as it is to all people today. Everyone needs adequate amounts of sleep to maintain their health. Sleeplessness is an epidemic, and we aren't even experiencing a global end of the world as we know it crisis. So just imagine how much harder it would be for people to fall asleep in the event of scenarios that captivate the minds of preppers across the globe. Stress makes it harder to sleep, and if everything around you is falling apart, good luck getting a good night's rest. The practical value of what we know about Shinobi and their studies of sleep is that rotating shifts should be implemented to secure watch over your domain during a disaster, conflict, or black swan event. Recognize that attention should be given to sleep systems that one keeps in the pack for emergencies, and how the lack of sleep will impact one mentally and physically.
If you can't use your phone to know where you are or where you need to go, will you be able to find your way in a crisis? What if you can no longer use your car? Do you have the fitness level necessary to travel long distances on foot? And if you do find yourself in such a situation where you need to travel from point A to point B in this way, do you have the gear, skills, and supplies that will sustain you while on the move? These considerations are relevant to one's survival if the world as we know it falls apart. A few centuries ago, people were far more adapted to the strain of moving over terrain by foot for many miles just to get to a market. And they didn't need Google Maps to know where they were or how to find their way home. This was definitely the case with the Shinobi of feudal Japan. To know where you are going, you need to know where you are. And if plotting longitude, you need to know when you are. Shinobi didn't have global positioning systems to figure this out. Instead, they had to rely on the capacity of human memory to work out their position. Their memory was typically stocked with all sorts of information about their local topography, as well as terrain features of distant provinces, and their methods of knowing compass directions relied on an extensive understanding of star constellations, lunar movements, and the Chinese zodiac. Volume 17 of the Bansen Shukai speaks of the need for Shinobi to study the stars by referring to star maps often enough that constellation patterns become easily recognized by the Shinobi, while Polaris, the North Star, is not directly mentioned in their texts. We know that Shinobi could work out north, south, east, and west by observing relationships between the star Hagun, the seventh star of the Big Dipper handle, and the time, month, or season. Compasses did exist in the days of the ninja, but these items were typically reserved for commanders and higher-ranking components of the army. However, Shinobi knew how to make their own compasses, as evidenced by Tenji of the Bansen Shukai, which describes the heating of a piece of iron oriented on a north-south axis and magnetizing it by the shaping and quenching process. The result is a piece of metal roughly 2.5 inches in length and 1/2 inch in width. Referred to the Shinobi as a small fish, this piece of metal was floated in water to work out the magnetic north-south axis. If a compass was not available, Shinobi knew how to estimate directions on the basis of lunar cycles and of course the rise and fall of the sun. These methods of calculating compass directions were obviated, however, in instances of travel to places a Shinobi was familiar with. The art of ninjutsu explicitly calls for memorization of road systems and a familiarity with several provinces beyond a ninja's local area. The Hoi no Maki of the Yokan Kajo Demoko Kugi scrolls of the ninja contains the traditions of Shinobi Mijimi no Kodo, or knowing roads, and Shinobi Mijimi Fumio no Kodo, or walking roads. These traditions communicate to us that ninjutsu involves knowing travel routes by memory rather than by using maps and navigation technology. They also tell us that Shinobi were constantly traveling on foot around their local provinces and beyond. In this way, knowledge of potential enemy provinces was collected prior to conflict, providing the ninja with highly valuable information pertinent to allied troop maneuvers and movements once exigent circumstances developed. If a Shinobi was not familiar with a territory for whatever reason, his ninjutsu training reminded him of the importance of establishing contacts with other Shinobi in various provinces. These were Shinobi contacts who resided in the territory of interest and knew the area well. Land navigation for a Shinobi largely relied on the accumulation of knowledge of the area prior to any emergency. But even with this map memory, their movements in conflict zones could be hampered or impeded by enemy checkpoints set up along well-known roads. To bypass these checkpoints, Shinobi had a few options at their disposal. First, a Shinobi would simply pass through the checkpoint under a pre-conflict cover that was already established. Ninjutsu traditions of knowing roads tell us that Shinobi would blend into the traffic of a travel route because they made a habit of using the roads frequently, so people got used to seeing the Shinobi on the roads in question. Therefore, when a checkpoint was set up, it was not so suspect to see the Shinobi attempting to pass through it. especially if the prior background for traveling the road was already known to the authorities. For example, a shinobi would have credible covers such as that of a horse dealer or merchants of various types, and even temple priests, as evidenced by traditions like Horokegakure no Koto, Buddha hiding, and Gyuba no Sute, or tradition of cattle and horses. If passing straight through a checkpoint was not possible, the next viable option was to find alternate routes around the checkpoint and to circumvent the checkpoint at night. The tradition of foxes and wolves, for example, advises one to emulate the behavior of wolves by avoiding where people typically travel and walk the less known paths, and to be like the fox by changing appearances. But this option could pose a navigational problem if the shinobi is not familiar with these lesser known travel conduits, and it shows in their ninjutsu texts. The Shoninki of 1681 gives advice on what to do if a shinobi is potentially lost on these less traveled paths, or if it is not clear which road the shinobi should travel on. One tradition states that the ninja should taste the road for its salt content and look for discarded sandals to tell them if there are people traveling on that path, whereas another tradition speaks of letting an old horse lead the shinobi through the unknown. If chancing the risk of getting lost to bypass a checkpoint was not appealing, another option a shinobi had was to dig a tunnel or hole under a wall or climb over it. These techniques are recorded in the traditions of the spider and connect us to the consideration of what gear a shinobi would carry while traveling. Typical items included a kaginawa, or grappling hook and rope for climbing, securing shelter, and for other cordage needs, a stone pencil for taking notes and making maps, an amigasa hat for hiding the face and shielding the head from the sun and rain, sanjaku tenugui, a multifunctional piece of cloth for filtering water, dressing wounds, concealing the face, a mask for smoke, and a rag for cleaning equipment, field medicine for fighting parasites and illness, and a fire starter or body warmer like an uchitake or danohi. The equipment carried by the shinobi would of course have been modified and swapped with other items depending on mission priorities. And for those of you wondering about 72-hour kits and go bags, yes, ninjutsu has a tradition concerning how they should carry gear called dogu mochio no kodo, the art of carrying your tools in a bag of leather. Shinobi would carry rations like rice and hunger pills, water, security items like knives, blinding powders, and more, as they traveled around getting to know the land and people, and the seasonal conditions that would make certain routes impassable. This activity requires stamina and muscular integrity, as walking long distances with a constant load on your back is taxing to the body. This constant walking under the load of your life-sustaining equipment is something people would have been used to in feudal Japan, whereas today we call it rucking, a form of recreational exercise. This alludes to the fitness standing of the shinobi of history. Walking, say, 20 to 30 miles a day with equipment every day requires physical fitness. Running from threats or engaging with an enemy at speed with the load of equipment on your back requires even more. This is why in a previous video titled The Overlooked Skill of the Ninja, I posited that ninjutsu training must have involved drilling the shinobi in sprints and running over long distances in varying terrain under load. Their lower body strength and endurance must have been tremendous when we consider that they would navigate over mountainous terrain where horses could not travel and would have to carry what they needed to persist for an extended time. In addition to all of this, ninjutsu texts teach us that shinobi were always scanning their environment for threats as they traveled. Shinrin Fushin no Kodo, the tradition of identifying suspicious woods, for example, speaks of how a ninja would avoid potential ambush points, and elsewhere in their writings we find references to staying wary of other travelers, especially at night. These are the key takeaways from this video. First, recognize that shinobi knew the areas they were operating in, and if they didn't, they had shinobi contacts who did, or they would get mapping information from local sources like temple monks. Ninjutsu students and the modern survivalists can benefit from this principle by making a habit of studying road systems and maps. If lost or needing to work out directions, a ninja knew how to estimate the north-south axis by observing the stars. We moderners could learn from this by knowing how to read the sky for the North Star Polaris, depending on your latitude, or make a shadow stick to determine direction by the sun. Shinobi would carry a compass needle to set in water to know what direction to go. so carry a compass or know how to make one. A ninja needed to have alternate routes worked out in advance as a contingency to address enemy checkpoints or natural phenomena like landslides, earthquakes, and floods that could make a primary route impassable. Long distance travel requires stopping to rest and refueling with calories and water. A shinobi carried the gear and had the skills to sustain themselves without modern infrastructure. Knowing where to find water along a route is essential. Traveling long distance on foot requires physical fitness. Ninjutsu students should take up practices of walking about their local areas often, and if possible, practice running at speed over long distances under load of the emergency supplies they plan on carrying in a crisis.
The human senses root us in reality insofar that the meaning of the stimuli they receive is accurately assessed and interpreted. Let me explain. Once there was a shinobi that intended to pay a visit to another ninja's house in the dead of night. With the utmost stealth characterizing his movements, as we might expect of a shinobi, he approached the house, but just as he was at the threshold of entering the dwelling, the shinobi turned around and left, abandoning the infiltration attempt altogether. Upon seeing each other the following evening, the owner of the house asked the shinobi why he didn't infiltrate into his house. This question alluded to the truth that the ninja in the dwelling detected the shinobi that night. The would-be shinobi infiltrator replied that he knew the ninja had awakened, so he decided not to go through with stealing into his house. A third ninja listening to the two speak asked how it was that the two detected each other. The ninja of the house stated he heard the insects in his yard grow quiet, indicating the presence of someone in the yard. The infiltrating shinobi, in turn, stated he heard mosquitoes moving about in the dwelling, indicating the ninja in the house had woken up. And so the two were tipped off to the activity of one another by their sense of hearing, the insects being the central indicator of the threat in this situation. This story is recorded in the Hoi no Maki of the Gokan Kajo Damukokugi scrolls of the ninja, and is important for the insight it conveys regarding the senses of a shinobi and how they pertain to situational awareness, threat detection, and communication as a two-way process between the ninja and his environment. Communication, in its essence, is to encode meaning and to present that meaning to intended recipients. Communication is occurring around us all the time in various forms, yet without the perceptual capacity to grasp what each sign in a communication string means, we are excluded from a meaningful conversation. We must learn the language, be it Morse code, a foreign tongue, lights and sirens, birds flying away from a forest, abstract symbols etched into buildings, colored rice, hand signals, musical tones from a conch shell, the body language of the individual we are observing, and more than I can list here, to discern the messages. Meaning is what the mind identifies. Psychology and meaning go hand in hand. So a shinobi would be instructed on how to convey meaning that is false, to conceal what is true, and vice versa in a manner that manipulates the psychology of the observer. This can get complicated. Take Ura Awase no Daiji, the principle of secret connection. It provides insight into what the art form of psychological manipulation would entail for a ninja. First, we must know that shinobi were well aware that the enemy would send spies to discern what useful intelligence they could about one's allies. This was just a simple fact of warfare and espionage that could not be avoided. Shinobi would turn this potential disadvantage into an advantage by flipping or converting the enemy's spy into a double agent through a number of actions that communicated care and concern for the enemy ninja, like buying them food and clothing and speaking of what would benefit their families, and generally displaying goodwill to the enemy ninja until their hearts and minds were effectively captured. With them now convinced to act as double agents, information about the enemy's disposition and activities could be provided until the time came to draw the enemy into a trap by turning these double agents into doomed spies. Look at it from this perspective. Being slighted by someone you think cares about you hurts tremendously, especially if you were manipulated in the first place to give up loyalty to your former leader to help this person, as may be the case with converted spies. Being angered as the relationship begins to sour, seeing through the facade, or being victim of the negative actions of the handler is only natural. And the feelings that develop as the abuse of the converted spy persists will include the desire to get back at this person who took advantage of one's heart and feelings. The converted spy continues to deliver on promises of information about the enemy, all the while holding a grudge against this new employer, who originally won him over with praise, flattery, gifts, and prospects of friendship. Then, one day, the double agent hears this handler speaking about a plan to attack the double agent's former master. Seeing his chance for vengeance and redemption, the double agent reverts loyalty back to his original side and tells his lord everything he has overheard while in the service of the enemy, including the plan now underway to attack the lord's army. It would appear that the shinobi handler on the other side, who deals in gifts, praise, and flattery, has been seen through to the core as just a manipulator too stupid to see the consequences of letting information about a vital plan slip to a converted spy he has angered. But, on the contrary, this seeming miscalculation was all part of the plan. The handler waits for the enemy lord to act on the information provided by the angered double agent, and then launches an offensive. Due to the indiscretion of the double agent, his lord has now walked right into a trap. The double agent is summarily executed in the aftermath by his lord, hence the term doomed spy is applied to these people. This should show you that ninjutsu is no joke when it comes to manipulation. One must appear to be a friend while simultaneously holding a knife behind one's back. No wonder paranoia is a mainstay of the espionage motif. You really do not know who you can trust.